What if everything you knew about your father was a lie? They called him a war hero, a man who risked everything to save his people. But one night, over a bottle of bourbon and a lifetime of guilt, he confessed the unthinkable. He didn't survive the war. He escaped it by handing over his brothers in arms to the enemy. Now his daughter is left with a terrifying question. Can you ever forgive the man who gave you life? If he took so many others, stay with us. This isn't just a story, it's a reckoning. Amira Kovacevic was born in St. Louis, Missouri in the fall of 1995, the daughter of Bosnian refugees who had escaped the brutal war in the early 1990s. Her mother, Layla, arrived in America carrying little more than family photos and hope for a better future. Her father, Ismet, came under a shadow of whispers, a man hailed by the local Bosnian community as a war hero and the sole survivor of a massacre in a remote mountain village. Throughout Amira's childhood, she heard stories of his bravery and survival against all odds. Yet her memories of him were faint fragments of a voice singing lullabies in a language she never fully understood, and a shadowy figure disappearing down a long hallway. Ismet vanished when Amira was just a toddler, long before she could ask questions or understand his true story. Despite his absence, his legend grew retold around dinner tables, community gatherings, and in local newsletters. Everyone seemed to know who Ismet Kovacevic was, except Amira. It wasn't until years later, during a late-night confession, that the truth behind the man's silence would finally come to light, forever changing her understanding of family loyalty and survival. Nestled high in the Dinaric Alps, the small village of Vranic was once a peaceful haven surrounded by dense forests and rushing streams, perfect for hunting and fishing. For generations, life moved slowly and predictably. The villagers, including young Ismet Kovacevic, knew little of the outside world beyond their mountain home. But as the 1990s dawned, a storm was gathering, one that would tear apart not only their homeland, but their very understanding of loyalty and survival. When the Bosnian War erupted, ethnic lines carved deep wounds across the country, turning neighbors into enemies. Ismet, barely in his 20s, found himself thrust into a brutal civil war, joining the local militia to protect his family and village from advancing Serb forces. For months, the villagers clung to hope, whispers of NATO intervention, and peacekeeping forces gave them strength. But as the enemy closed in, the once lush mountains echoed with the sounds of gunfire and fear. Men from Vranic formed a desperate defense holding the line against overwhelming odds. Families were sent to safer neighboring villages, trusting that the militia could shield them. Yet, as the siege tightened and snipers claimed one defender after another, reality grew grim. The peace they'd known was gone, replaced by a daily struggle to survive. Ismet's world shrank to a constant battle protect. The innocent hold the village and pray for a miracle. It was in these final days, surrounded by death and desperation, that Ismet faced a choice that would haunt him forever. A choice that would ripple through time, leaving scars on everyone connected to his story. As the siege of Vranic tightened, Ismet and his fellow militia members faced a grim reality. Their once peaceful mountain village had become a battleground hemmed in by the advancing Serb forces. The men knew they were outnumbered and outgunned, but their resolve was fueled by a fierce determination to protect their families and way of life. One cold early morning, Ismet volunteered to scout ahead, searching for a possible way through the enemy lines, a narrow window of hope to save those they loved. What he found was a glimmer of possibility, an unguarded clearing on the eastern edge of the village, overlooked by the enemy, who assumed no one would dare cross an open field, watched by sniper nests on the surrounding hills. It seemed like a stroke of luck, a chance to break free from the tightening noose. Quietly, Ismet led his comrades to the clearing, just as the first rays of sunlight pierced the morning fog. They ran heart-pounding, breath ragged across the open field, voices rising with relief and hope. "You're a goddamn genius," one shouted. But that hope was shattered in an instant as the Serb forces opened fire, turning the clearing into a massacre. Machine guns raked through the group snipers, picked off the men one by one, and chaos erupted. Ismet barely escaped, diving for cover in the woods, his mind a whirlwind of fear and disbelief. He watched in horror as his brothers in arms were cut down, their blood staining the ground they'd fought so hard to protect. When the shooting stopped and the Serbs began burning Vranic to the ground, Ismet was faced with an impossible choice. Instead of rallying his comrades, he made a desperate decision, one that would haunt him for the rest of his life. Armed with a makeshift white flag, fashioned from a torn shirt and broken stick, he approached the enemy lines alone. Rather than a battle cry, he carried a surrender that cost his friends everything, a betrayal that bought his own survival at an unimaginable price. The truth Ismet kept hidden for years finally spilled out one night during a fierce argument with Layla, his wife. The weight of guilt he carried had become unbearable, crushing the man behind the heroic legend. In a voice trembling with anguish, Ismet confessed what no one in the community dared to whisper. He hadn't just stumbled into a tragic ambush. He had betrayed his comrades. That morning in the woods, instead of bravely scouting a safe path, he had carried a white flag of surrender, walking straight into the enemy's arms. He struck a secret deal with the Serb commander, a price for his survival that demanded the massacre of the very men he once called brothers. Ismet led his militia into an open field, not to save them, but to hand them over. The battlefield wasn't just strewn with bodies, it was littered with the broken pieces of his conscience. Layla listened in stunned silence as Ismet described stepping over the lifeless forms of lifelong friends, each one a stark reminder of the cost of his survival. He admitted wishing at times the Serbs had just ended his life, along with theirs. This confession shattered the fragile image the community had built around him, a war hero, a survivor, a father. Instead, he was a man haunted by betrayal, trapped in a cycle of depression and heavy drinking, unable to forgive himself. The shadow of his secret fractured their marriage, driving a wedge between past and present truth and denial. Layla, overwhelmed by the horror of his choice, made the painful decision to ask him to leave. She knew the man she married was gone. The man who walked away that night was a stranger bearing a soul crushed by guilt and shame. Ismet vanished without looking back, leaving behind a family wrapped in silence and unanswered questions. For years, Amira grew up in the absence of the father she barely knew, and the mystery that surrounded his legacy. The revelation wasn't just a family secret, it was a reckoning, a story that would redefine everything she thought she knew about loyalty, survival, and the true cost of war. After that night, Ismet was gone, vanished as completely as the man Amira had only just begun to understand. Layla, burdened by the weight of his confession, felt there was no room left in their home for the ghost of betrayal and pain. She told him to leave, hoping that distance might bring clarity, or at least some peace. But Ismet never returned. Unlike before, when he'd disappear for days, nursing his demons in bars or wandering the streets, this time he drove away with no intention of coming back. His absence left a silence that filled every corner of the house and every moment of Amira's childhood. The man who was supposed to be her protector and guide became a shadow, a question mark etched into the fabric of her family's story. The community whispered, speculating whether he was dead or alive, lost or hiding. The truth, however, was buried beneath layers of shame and regret. For Amira, growing up without her father was a confusing mix of pride and pain. Pride in the heroic myth everyone believed, and pain from the void his disappearance carved into her life. The man who had promised a safety and love became a stranger, a secret kept locked away in the quiet corners of her mind. His story, once a source of hope, turned into a haunting reminder that sometimes survival comes at the cost of everything that truly matters. Growing up, Amira carried the weight of her father's story like an invisible burden she couldn't quite put into words. The community around her spoke of Ismet as a hero, the sole survivor who had faced impossible odds. Yet, in her heart, the narrative was far more complicated. She wrestled with the knowledge of his betrayal, a secret that cast long shadows over her sense of identity and belonging. At family gatherings, she often felt like an outsider peering into a world where everyone else seemed to understand a story she only half knew. The legacy of her father's actions was a tangled web of love, shame, and unanswered questions. Could she honor the man who gave her life while grappling with the man who sacrificed so much more than he saved? The silence left by Ismet's departure echoed in her mind, filling the spaces where a father's guidance and protection should have been. It was a silence that spoke volumes about the cost of survival and the scars left by war scars that reach far beyond the battlefield. As she grew older, Amira began to understand that her father's story was not just about his choices, but about the heavy burden carried by those who live in the aftermath. It was about the families left behind, trying to make sense of truths too painful to fully face. The question lingered in her mind. Could she forgive the man who had betrayed his brothers if it meant preserving the fragile thread of her own existence? This internal struggle shaped not only her understanding of family, but also her view of loyalty, sacrifice, and the complicated nature of human survival in times of unimaginable crisis. The legacy was not a simple tale of heroism or villainy. It was a profound reckoning with the gray spaces between. In the end, Amira realized that some truths don't offer the comfort of clear answers or the balm of forgiveness. Her father's choices, as painful and complicated as they were, became a silent legacy she had to carry on her own terms. Forgiveness, she understood, wasn't a simple act or a given right. It was a deeply personal journey that may never fully unfold. The man who once walked away from his past left behind more than just memories. He left a question mark hanging over her life, a reminder that survival sometimes demands unimaginable sacrifices. In the quiet moments of reflection, Amira embraced the uncomfortable reality that her family's story was one of broken trust, complicated love, and the haunting cost of war. Yet within that complexity lay a profound lesson about the human spirit's resilience, the capacity to live, to question, and to seek meaning even when the past refuses to be neatly packaged or forgiven. Her journey was not about excusing betrayal, but about acknowledging that the lines between right and wrong heroism and cowardice are often blurred by circumstance. The legacy her father left was not a tale of black and white, but a testament to the messy, painful, and deeply human struggle to survive and find peace amidst the ruins. It was a story that, while rooted in the horrors of war, ultimately spoke to the universal quest for understanding and redemption. Sometimes, the hardest battles are not fought on distant fields, but within the walls of our own hearts. Amira's story reminds us that survival often comes with a price no one wants to pay, and that the search for truth can be both a burden and a path to healing. In facing the shadows of the past, we may never find all the answers, but in the courage to ask the questions, we begin to understand what it truly means to forgive, to endure, and to move forward. Most people remember their grandfathers for the bedtime stories, the smell of pipe tobacco, or the way they smiled when they thought no one was watching. I remember mine for something else. For 3 days before he died, a Catholic priest visited his hospital room in secret. The door was always closed, the curtains always drawn. And when I asked my mother why, she just shook her head and said, "There are things you don't need to know, but I needed to know." And what I found out has haunted me ever since. Because the man who taught me how to fish, who built birdhouses in our backyard, who ran a dozen small businesses in the Bay Area with a smile and a handshake, that man was also an executioner, a mass killer. And what he confessed before he died should never have been heard by anyone, but there were always gaps in what we knew about him. Little silences tucked between the praise, the long pauses when someone mentioned the past. As a kid, I didn't notice. As a teenager, I started to wonder. And as an adult, I began to ask questions. The one that cracked everything open was simple. Why can't I visit the country Grandpa came from? I just wanted to see the places he left behind, the rivers he used to fish in, the village he talked about once, then never again. But the more I asked, the colder the answers became. Until one day, my mother sat me down with trembling hands and told me a story that would change how I saw my family, my grandfather, and myself. At first, my questions seemed harmless. I'd ask my mom what town Grandpa was from or whether we still had family overseas. She'd smile politely and say something vague like, it's complicated, before steering the conversation elsewhere. But the older I got, the more persistent I became. I wanted to visit Southeast Asia, not just as a tourist, but to trace my roots, to walk the same dirt roads my grandfather once walked, to see the landscapes that shaped him. The more I pushed, the more tense things got at home. My mom began shutting down completely whenever I brought it up. Until one rainy afternoon, she finally broke. She sat me down at the kitchen table, her hands trembling as she gripped a chipped mug of tea. I'll never forget the way her voice shook when she said, "You can't go back, Daniel. Not ever. If they find out who you are, they might kill you." I laughed at first, thinking it was some overprotective exaggeration. But then I saw the look in her eyes, and I knew. This wasn't fear. It was memory, and it ran deep. I didn't ask about the trip again, not for months, but the tension lingered in the house like smoke. My mom avoided the subject entirely, and my questions gathered dust alongside old photo albums no one opened anymore. Then one summer, everything shifted. My grandfather, who had already beaten cancer twice, was diagnosed a third time. This time, the doctors gave him months, maybe weeks. We gathered around him. Me, my mom, my aunt, and Grandma Lien, trying to make him comfortable. But something changed in him. He stopped pretending. And then, quietly, he asked to see a priest. Father Matthew came every afternoon. At first, we thought it was just for comfort. Final blessings, soft words. But the visits grew longer, more intense. One night, I passed the door and heard Grandpa sobbing, choking out words I couldn't make out. My mom and Grandma sat outside his room like sentries, both pale and silent. After the third visit, my mom told me not to ask what he was confessing. "You don't want to know," she said. But I did. I needed to. Because deep down, I felt the shift. The warmth I once saw in my grandfather's eyes had turned to something else, something darker, something old. And whatever it was finally demanding to be seen. My mother never meant for me to hear what she eventually told me, but some stories have a way of clawing their way to the surface. A few weeks after my grandfather passed, I found her sitting alone on the back porch, staring into nothing with red-rimmed eyes. I asked if she was okay. She shook her head. Then, without looking at me, she said, "You need to know what kind of man your grandfather really was. His name was Bao Thien Vo, but to the men who worked under him in the jungles of the Golden Triangle, he was simply called the Enforcer. Back in the 1970s, he had served as the chief disciplinarian for a powerful heroin trafficking syndicate that operated in the remote borderlands of Myanmar, Laos, and Thailand. His job wasn't to make deals or handle shipments. His job was punishment. Swift, brutal, final. He once tied a village elder to a post and lit her on fire in front of her entire community for stealing a handful of opium to ease her son's pain. He executed runaways, thieves, and anyone who disobeyed the syndicate's strict rules. Hanging, beheading, gunshots to the face, he did it all without flinching, and no one dared resist him. My mom said that when he confessed it to the priest, his voice didn't even shake. He told it like it was logistics, she whispered. Like he was remembering supply routes, not lives. That was the man who taught me how to tie a fishing knot, who laughed at my school jokes. That was my grandfather, and I didn't know who he truly was until it was far too late. Eventually, the violence caught up with him. My mom said she never knew the exact moment things turned, but at some point Grandpa realized he'd made too many enemies. Maybe it was whispers in the jungle, a failed hit, or just a gut feeling, but he knew his time was up. And so, Bao Thien Vo disappeared. Not vanished in the way most fugitives do. He vanished in plain sight. Using stacks of cash and forged South Vietnamese diplomatic documents, he arranged passage for himself. Grandma Lien, my mom, and her sisters onto a military aircraft bound for the U.S. It was 1975. Saigon was falling, and chaos made everything easier. When he stepped onto that plane in a tailored suit with polished shoes and silent confidence, no one questioned a thing. Once in California, he reinvested the same money he earned through death into new life. Asian grocery stores, banh mi bakeries, furniture, wholesalers, even a few tech-adjacent supply chains during the early 90s. He became what most people called a community pillar. But Mom said he never spoke of the jungle again, never mentioned the villages, never uttered a single name, as if silence alone could erase the screams that once followed him. Among the stories my grandfather confessed before he died, there was one my mother said she would never forget. It wasn't just the cruelty, it was the scale. It started when an American NGO backed by government funds began traveling through the rural provinces of western Myanmar, offering free medical aid and vaccinations to children. On the surface, it seemed like a blessing. But for my grandfather and his old employers, it was a threat, a very real one. Not just because foreigners were poking around their territory, but because the syndicate feared what vaccines might represent surveillance Western influence and most dangerously hope. According to Grandpa, the order came down swiftly. No child in their controlled zones was to be vaccinated. Village leaders were told to play along, to smile, offer tea, and act grateful, but under no circumstances were families to participate. Any parent who defied the order would face consequences. At first, it seemed like the villages complied. But the NGO volunteers were clever. They built trust with small gestures. Hydration salts, baby formula, aspirin for fevers. And soon, some parents quietly allowed their children to receive polio shots. When word reached the syndicate, they sent Bao Thien to correct the situation. He didn't just punish the parents. He gathered the names of the vaccinated children, took them from their homes under the pretense of medical observation, and poisoned them. All of them. My mother said he never described exactly how just that he ensured no trace would lead back to the syndicate. Later, the bodies were found stacked just outside the village's tiny, lifeless, silent. Even the priest couldn't speak after hearing that part. And my mother, who had always tried to see some shred of goodness in her father, said it was the moment she stopped trying. After that confession, my mother said something changed in the room, something hard to describe. The air grew heavy. Even Father Matthew, a man who had spent decades hearing the darkest secrets of dying souls, went quiet. Grandpa had wept during other parts of his confession, cried over the woman he burned, the men he executed, but when he spoke about the children, he didn't cry. He just looked down as if he were reporting a weather forecast. It was only when he finished, when he said, "They didn't scream," not even once, that his voice cracked. That was the moment it broke him. My mother said he didn't speak for nearly an hour after that. He just lay there clutching a rosary, eyes open, lips trembling. He kept calling Father Matthew back day after day, as if each visit might peel away a layer of his past. But no matter how much he confessed, there was no cleansing that final act, no prayer that could drown it out. My grandmother stopped sitting in on the visits after that one. She couldn't look at him the same way again. And for my mother, the man who had once protected her from nightmares had now become the very thing nightmares were made of. After Grandpa's death, I thought about going to Myanmar more than ever. I wanted to see it for myself, the land he came from, the places tied to these awful memories. But when I brought it up again, my mother didn't just dismiss the idea. She panicked. I'd never seen that look in her eyes before, pure fear, stripped of logic. She grabbed my wrist and said, "You don't understand. There are people still alive who would kill you just for being his grandson." At first, I thought she meant revenge relatives of the victims' villagers who remembered. But it wasn't just that. She explained that some of the syndicate's old connections still had power, especially in remote provinces. Some of them had traded drug empires for government positions. They don't need a reason, she said. They just need a name. The past, it turns out, doesn't always stay buried, especially when that past involves mass graves and whispered deals in jungle clearings. My grandfather had vanished from one world and reappeared in another. But I wasn't allowed to cross that same line. To them, I wasn't just an outsider. I was a bloodline. And in their world, bloodlines come with consequences. I used to wear my last name with pride, Tran, an Americanized echo of my family's Vietnamese roots. But now it feels heavier, like a stone I carry in my chest. Not because I did anything wrong, but because of what that name is tied to. Sometimes I wonder what it means to inherit a legacy you never asked for. I didn't choose my grandfather. I didn't choose his sins. But I live in the shadow of them, just the same. Every time someone praises our family's success story, how Bao and Vo came here with nothing and built everything I have to bite my tongue. Because I know what paid for that first shipment of cookware, that first restaurant lease, that first store on Market Street. They were built not just with money, but with silence, with fire, with poison. And even if no one else remembers, I do. Sometimes I wonder if that's my real inheritance, not the name, not the blood, but the knowing. I don't tell this story to shock anyone. I tell it because I believe some truths deserve daylight, no matter how ugly they are. My grandfather's crimes were buried beneath decades of silence, prosperity, and carefully curated family myths. But silence doesn't erase the past. It just gives it more time to grow teeth. Now that I know, I carry it with me, quietly, respectfully. Not out of shame, but out of responsibility. Because stories like his don't just vanish when the person dies. They echo, in names and warnings, in things left unsaid. So if you've made it this far, maybe remember this: not all monsters live in distant lands or wear fangs. Some live long lives, attend church on Sundays, and teach their grandkids how to plant tomatoes. And sometimes the scariest truths are the ones that sound most like family history. Some stories are meant to be passed down, others are meant to be carried. This one I carry. Not to justify, not to forgive, but to remember. Because forgetting doesn't heal anything. And in a world that often buries its darkest truths beneath polite smiles and perfect photo albums, I choose to say mine out loud. Not for him. For me. In the golden age of American ambition, few names carried the same weight as the Whitfords. From their stately brownstone on Manhattan's Upper East Side to their sprawling estate in Dutchess County, the Whitford family epitomized wealth, influence, and patriotic nobility. At the helm stood Jonathan Whitford Sr., a former U.S. ambassador to the United Kingdom and chairman of one of the most powerful banking consortiums in New York. With his tailored suits, silver hair, and firm handshake, he was the embodiment of the American dream turned dynasty. His wife Margaret, a descendant of old New England bloodlines, had once graced the cover of Life magazine as America's First Lady in Waiting. Together, they built a family not just of privilege but of expectation. Their children were groomed accordingly. Samuel, the eldest, was destined for the Senate. Matthew, the charming middle son, attended Yale Law and interned under a Supreme Court justice. The youngest daughter, Catherine, excelled in international diplomacy by the time she turned 25. But there was another child, Eleanor. She was rarely spoken of in public, seldom seen in photographs, and never mentioned in political speeches. To the outside world, it was as if she had simply never existed. But inside the Whitford home, Eleanor's presence haunted every gilded hallway, like a silent echo of something long buried. Eleanor Whitford entered the world on a rainy September morning in 1919, during the height of the Spanish flu pandemic that had emptied New York's streets and overrun its hospitals. Her birth, already precarious, took a disturbing turn when the family's private physician failed to arrive in time. A panicked nurse, desperate to delay labor until medical help arrived, instructed Margaret Whitford to hold the baby in. What followed was 2 agonizing hours, with Eleanor's head trapped in the birth canal, an error that would quietly alter the course of her life. At first, the Whitfords spoke of the birth in hushed tones, but tried to carry on as if nothing were amiss. After all, there were appearances to maintain charity galas, political fundraisers, and photo spreads in the Saturday Evening Post. Yet behind closed doors, they were watching Eleanor closely. Something was off. She didn't track movement like other infants. Her limbs moved stiffly. Her gaze often blank. Though never openly discussed, a shadow had crept into the pristine world of the Whitfords, one that no amount of money or manners could quite keep hidden. As Eleanor grew, the subtle signs became harder to ignore. While her siblings crawled, ran and spoke in full sentences, she remained locked in a fog of delays and gentle confusion. At age 2, she still could not form words beyond simple sounds. At 4, she needed help walking without falling. Her expressions were vague, as if she were searching for something just beyond reach. But in the Whitford household, where decorum reigned and appearances were everything, Eleanor's differences were quietly swept under the rug. Margaret, ever composed, dismissed concerns as overreactions. Late bloomer, she'd tell friends with a delicate wave of her hand. Jonathan, meanwhile, hired the finest private tutors money could buy, hoping education might compensate for nature's stumble. A converted library on the 2nd floor became Eleanor's classroom. There, with a woman named Miss Halbridge, trained in both Montessori and patience, Eleanor was taught to mimic more than understand. She could recite poetry, trace letters, even smile on cue. But comprehension lagged like a distant drumbeat. Doctors were consulted discreetly, their visits recorded as educational evaluations in the family ledger. One neurologist noted signs of mild cerebral deficiency, a diagnosis so vague it could be downplayed at cocktail parties. But behind the marble columns and velvet drapes, Eleanor's world was increasingly one of isolation. Her siblings, bustling with school and social events, had little time for her. She watched them from windows, often clutching her favorite cloth doll, a gift from her French nanny, as if it were her only confidant. It wasn't that the Whitfords didn't love Eleanor. In their own way, they did. But love in that house came wrapped in ribbon, sealed with discretion, and tucked behind locked doors. And for Eleanor, childhood became less about discovery and more about concealment. By the time Eleanor turned 13, the Whitfords' strategy shifted from intervention to illusion. Rather than confront her challenges, they began crafting a carefully curated version of Eleanor. One who smiled sweetly in staged family portraits. One whose absence from debutante teas was explained away by vague references to a private European education. In reality, Eleanor had been quietly sent to the St. Cecilia Convent School in Providence, Rhode Island, a secluded institution known for its discretion as much as its stone walls. There, Eleanor lived in a small suite on the convent's upper floor, apart from the other students. Her education took place in solitude, taught by a single instructor and occasionally supervised by 2 kindly but vigilant nuns. While other girls attended dances and read Shakespeare aloud in class, Eleanor practiced cursive for hours, struggled through basic arithmetic, and learned to smile without showing too much confusion. The Whitfords ensured their influence was felt even there. A new rose garden was installed in honor of Margaret's generous donation, and a brand new tennis court appeared just months after Eleanor arrived. In return, the school never asked questions when Eleanor's older brother Samuel appeared to escort her to a winter formal posing as a chaperone, subtly shielding her from the judgment of other students. Though lonely, Eleanor began to internalize the role crafted for her. She knew when to nod, when to pause, when to answer with a memorized phrase, To outsiders, she was simply shy and refined, if a little unusual. But beneath that carefully polished veneer was a teenage girl who sensed more than understood that she didn't quite fit the world she was born into. And within the marble halls of the Whitford legacy, that truth was the family's most delicate secret. For a fleeting moment in her late teens, Eleanor seemed to blossom, if only in the carefully controlled corners where she was allowed to exist. Her movements were more graceful, her sentences slightly more fluid, and her smile came more easily, even if still rehearsed. At St. Cecilia's, she discovered a love for pottery. The quiet repetition of shaping clay offered her a kind of peace that language never could. Her small vases, often uneven, but full of earnest charm, began to line the windowsills of her suite. When Eleanor turned 19, the Whitfords allowed her to join the family on a diplomatic trip to London. It was a tightly choreographed appearance, part of her father's attempt to project unity and grace abroad. On the final night, she was presented at Buckingham Palace, where she had practiced her curtsy for weeks. She tripped slightly, catching herself with a wobbly knee, but the royal court, in their polished restraint, simply smiled. To the outside world, the event was a quiet success. Margaret boasted to acquaintances that Eleanor had made her mark in London society, and a single blurry photo of her in a white gown made it into the New York Times society page. For Eleanor, though it was more than just an appearance, it was the closest she'd ever come to being seen. For once, she wasn't hidden. And for a heartbeat, it felt like enough. But the glow of Eleanor's London moment faded quickly after their return to New York. In the months that followed, a subtle shift began to unsettle the carefully maintained facade. She grew restless, moody, prone to long silences, interrupted by sudden bursts of irritation. At first, Margaret attributed it to hormones, or perhaps homesickness for the quiet routine of the convent. But the change deepened. Eleanor, now in her early 20s, began slipping out of her supervised residence at night. Once, a driver spotted her walking alone along Fifth Avenue just past midnight. Another time, a housemaid found a half-packed suitcase under her bed. The Whitfords were alarmed, not only because Eleanor was behaving unpredictably, but because her behavior, if exposed, could become political dynamite. With her brother Samuel now eyeing a congressional seat, and her father still advising senators and diplomats, they couldn't risk a scandal involving the strange sister wandering the city at night. At a summer retreat in the Berkshires, Eleanor lashed out at a visiting cousin throwing a glass ashtray across the parlor. The cousin wasn't hurt, but the message was clear. Eleanor was slipping from their control. Rumors among the staff hinted at screaming fits, violent outbursts, and even seizures. Some whispered about a secret romance. Others blamed stress or female hysteria. No one truly knew what Eleanor wanted. Perhaps not even Eleanor herself. But for the first time in her life, she wasn't just compliant, she was unpredictable. And in the Whitford family, where silence was currency and image was everything, unpredictability wasn't just inconvenient, it was dangerous. By the fall of 1941, the Whitfords had grown desperate. Eleanor's increasingly erratic behavior, her unpredictable outbursts, nocturnal disappearances, and flashes of violent confusion had outpaced their ability to contain it behind estate walls and family whispers. Jonathan Whitford Sr., ever the strategist, saw the situation not as a crisis of compassion, but of control. And so, without consulting his wife, he arranged a meeting with Dr. Lester Day, one of the nation's most respected neurologists, and Dr. Franklin Murrow, a rising figure in the emerging field of psychosurgery. The treatment they proposed had recently gained traction in elite medical circles, the prefrontal lobotomy. It was touted as revolutionary, a solution for patients who could not be tamed by conventional therapy. But even then, whispers followed the procedure. Results varied wildly. Some patients grew calm, others became vacant shells. Still, Jonathan moved forward, arranging for Eleanor to be quietly admitted to a private clinic outside Hartford, Connecticut. He told Margaret it was a wellness retreat. In truth, It was a surgical chamber. According to records later revealed by hospital archivists, Eleanor was sedated but awake for the procedure. As Dr. Murrow guided a narrow blade-like instrument through holes drilled in her skull, Dr. Day asked Eleanor to recite nursery rhymes and the Pledge of Allegiance. The doctors gauged the depth of the incision based on how her speech faltered. When her voice slurred and her gaze emptied, they knew they had gone far enough. The results were devastating. Eleanor could no longer form coherent sentences. She lost motor coordination on her left side and began experiencing bladder incontinence. The vibrant, if troubled young woman who once dreamed of royal courts and pottery wheels was now reduced to a blank stare and a limp grip. When Margaret learned the truth days later, she collapsed in the marble foyer of their home. But the damage was done. Eleanor was no longer a liability to the family's reputation. She was instead a secret so heavy it bent the Whitfords' polished legacy into something colder, something cruel. And so, while campaign speeches were being written upstairs and photographers arranged portraits in the gardens, Eleanor disappeared, tucked away into a place the public would never see, and that the family would pretend had never existed. In the months following the lobotomy, Eleanor Whitford was quietly transferred to a remote care facility in southern Wisconsin, a Catholic-run institution known as Willowgate Home for Special Residents. On paper, she was listed as Miss Eleanor W., a private client requiring long-term neurological supervision. But in reality, Eleanor had been erased. Her name never appeared in public documents again. No press mention, no family acknowledgments. Not even a holiday card from the Whitford household bore her signature. Her father, perhaps out of guilt or image preservation, funded the construction of a small brick cottage just outside the main campus, a home the nuns would call Whitford Haven. There, Eleanor lived under 24-hour care provided by two elderly sisters who referred to her only as our girl. She could no longer walk without assistance, and her speech was reduced to low hums and indistinct murmurs. Her days were repetitive walks around a garden path, warm oatmeal for breakfast, supervised sessions with a ceramic instructor who gently guided her trembling hands over the clay. Though she was given a dog for companionship and a driver for infrequent excursions, Eleanor's world shrank to the size of a single acre. No visits from her parents, no birthday celebrations, no acknowledgement of the once elegant debutante who had stood in Buckingham Palace. Within the cloistered calm of Whitford Haven, time stood still. And so did she, frozen in a life crafted by others, for their comfort not hers. For over 20 years, Eleanor remained hidden from the world, and in many ways, from her own family. Margaret never returned to Wisconsin, not even once Jonathan Sr. Despite funding, her care kept her name off every Christmas letter, every wedding toast, every official biography. Her siblings were told she had chosen a quiet life, one unsuited for society. They believed it, or at least pretended to. Only after Jonathan suffered a debilitating stroke in 1965, ironically rendering him unable to speak or walk, did the walls around Eleanor begin to crack. With his grip on the family narrative finally loosened, Eleanor's youngest sister, Catherine, traveled to Willowgate. What she found there shattered her. The sister she remembered, awkward yes, but bright-eyed and warm, was now a frail woman who stared through her as if through fogged glass. Still, Catherine returned again and again, and slowly so did the others. By the late 60s, Eleanor was taken on small visits to family homes in Cape Cod and winter stays in Palm Beach. She never regained full speech, but with help she could walk short distances and respond to familiar music with the trace of a smile. Her reintroduction to the family wasn't a redemption, but it was at last a recognition. The truth about Eleanor Whitford might have remained buried forever if not for a determined biographer and a single offhand remark. In 1987, while researching the political ascent of Samuel Whitford, historian Diana Penwell was granted access to select family records and interviewed several longtime staff. One housemaid, now retired, mentioned the girl in Wisconsin. That one phrase, casual, almost wistful, led Penwell down a rabbit hole of redacted documents, sealed medical records, and decades-old correspondence. The result was the Whitford's power legacy and silence, a best-selling exposé that shocked the nation. For Americans who had idolized the Whitfords as paragons of family values and public service, the revelation was like a crack across marble. The idea that a daughter, intelligent, vulnerable, and once full of dreams, had been medically mutilated and hidden away to protect a family name ignited public outrage. Talk shows dissected the ethics. Medical historians condemned the procedure as barbaric. Mental health advocates pointed to Eleanor's case as a painful reminder of society's long history of stigmatizing neurodivergence. Though the family issued a statement describing Eleanor as deeply loved and quiet by nature, the damage was already done. The myth of the flawless dynasty was broken. And in its place stood something far more human, a story of shame, secrecy, and one woman's quiet endurance behind the veil of power. Eleanor Whitford passed away quietly on a snowy morning in January 2002, at the age of 83, surrounded by her two sisters and the same nun who had cared for her for over 3 decades. Her death was noted briefly in the New York Times obituary section, described simply as the beloved daughter of Jonathan and Margaret Whitford. But for those who knew her true story, it marked the closing of one of the darkest, most haunting chapters in the history of America's so-called dynasties. She was buried beside her parents in the family's private cemetery in Dutchess County, her name etched on a modest headstone, Eleanor Grace Whitford, 1919-2002. It was the first time many in the extended family had seen her full name engraved in stone. But her legacy didn't end there. Her youngest sister, Catherine, established the Eleanor Grace Foundation, a nonprofit dedicated to supporting individuals with intellectual disabilities and advocating against involuntary medical treatments. In classrooms, courtrooms, and quiet living rooms across the country, Eleanor's story continues to echo, not as a political scandal, but as a deeply human cautionary tale. In a family obsessed with appearances, Eleanor was the one who taught them too late that love must include truth. Eleanor Whitford never gave a speech, never ran for office, and never appeared on a ballot, but her life spoke volumes. In the silence, she was forced to endure a deeper truth, emerged one that outlasted headlines and legacies. Not every tragedy fades into obscurity. Some, like hers, become quiet revolutions, changing how we see dignity, family, and the cost of keeping secrets. Perched atop a windswept hill just outside New Haven, Connecticut, the Whitaker estate had stood for nearly a century as a symbol of old New England nobility. The family behind it, wealthy landowner Jonathan Whitaker and his much younger wife Margaret Ellsworth, was the product of a strategic union between two powerful bloodlines. Jonathan, 62 at the time of their marriage, hailed from a long line of agricultural magnates, while Margaret came from the Ellsworths of Boston, a family steeped in political ambition and colonial pride. Their marriage, while publicly celebrated, was quietly understood to be a transaction, one that promised land to the Ellsworths and a potential male heir to the Whitakers. With 3 daughters already and no son to carry the name, Jonathan was nearing the end of his years with a deepening sense of urgency. And when Margaret, at age 37, announced she was pregnant again, the house on Whitaker Hill stirred with hope. But as history would later show, some blessings come at a terrible cost. When news of Margaret's late pregnancy spread across Whitaker Hill, it was met with cautious excitement. Guests at summer garden parties whispered behind lace fans, wondering aloud if Jonathan's age, now well past 65, could truly allow for one last shot at a male heir. The Ellsworths, ever calculated, viewed the pregnancy as a political victory. The Whitakers, especially the aging Jonathan, saw it as a final chance at legacy. On a bitterly cold January morning in 1884, Silas Ellsworth Whitaker entered the world beneath heavy snowfall, and strained smiles. At first, all seemed well. But as the weeks passed and the child's features became more pronounced, quiet murmurs grew louder. Silas didn't resemble Jonathan or his three sisters in the slightest. While the Whitaker line was known for sandy blonde hair and pale blue eyes, Silas had a mop of black hair and deep storm-colored eyes, traits that matched no one in the immediate household. Still, with no clear alternative and reputations on the line, the family leaned hard into their fiction. A son had arrived. The name would live on. No further questions allowed. By the time Silas turned 2, it was clear he was no ordinary child. While other toddlers stumbled through their first words, Silas was stringing together full sentences and asking unnerving questions about death dissection and the way light shifted through a window pane at dusk. Margaret insisted his intellect was a gift, a sign of the exceptional bloodline he carried. Jonathan, though privately unsettled, praised the boy's sharp mind to friends and clergy. But intelligence alone couldn't explain the emotional coldness that followed. During a spring picnic, another child invited from a neighboring estate tripped and bloodied his face on a rock. As the boy sobbed in pain, Silas stood nearby, watching in silence. Then, without a word, he sat back down and resumed building a twig structure as though nothing had happened. The maids talked. The groundskeeper avoided him. Margaret brushed off the concerns as gossip bred from envy. But behind closed doors, even the sisters, now young women, kept their distance. Silas didn't cry, didn't laugh like other boys, and seemed untouched by joy or sorrow. There was a mind behind his eyes, certainly, but it was one no one in the Whitaker house could fully understand or trust. By the time Silas turned 6, the staff at Whitaker Hill had grown used to the boy's strange moods and glassy stares, but nothing prepared them for what came next. The estate, grand as it was, had always struggled with a rodent problem, particularly in the winter months. Rather than poison the mice, an approach Margaret deemed too unsightly, dozens of spring traps were placed discreetly throughout the property. The housekeeper assigned a young footman to check and reset the traps each morning, ensuring no guest would be greeted by a grim little corpse beneath an armchair. For a time, the system worked. But then oddities began. Traps were found triggered, but empty bait missing without trace. The staff whispered about clever rats or bad luck. But one morning, the footman, acting on instinct, asked Margaret for permission to inspect Silas's room. What he found silenced the house for weeks. In a small cedar cabinet near the boy's bed, nestled between sketchbooks and crumpled papers, were a dozen dead mice, neatly dissected, some with internal organs pinned open like pages of a science manual. Beside them lay a scalpel, not a toy, but a real one, sharp and medical grade. Margaret claimed it was part of a science kit, gifted by a distant uncle. Jonathan said nothing. The maids refused to enter his room after dusk, and as the snow began to fall again across the grounds, those who worked the estate wondered not for the first time what exactly had been born into the Whitaker name. Spring brought a new presence to Whitaker Hill. Edmund Ellsworth, Margaret's younger brother, returned from 6 years abroad in the Pacific. He arrived just after Silas's 7th birthday, tall and sun-worn, with a strange stillness about him. The house had not seen Edmund since before Silas was born, and his return was met with polite excitement, though some of the older staff exchanged glances when he stepped through the door. From the moment Edmund laid eyes on Silas, a current passed between them, silent and unmistakable. It wasn't just that the boy looked eerily like him. From the deep-set eyes to the sharp chin, it was the way they seemed to understand each other without speaking. At meals, Edmund would glance at Silas, and the boy would giggle, nod, or shift in response. When walking the gardens, their conversations were quiet, sometimes wordless, but strangely charged. Silas, usually withdrawn, became animated in his uncle's presence, even affectionate. The household couldn't ignore it. The resemblance, once merely curious, became haunting. One housemaid confided to the cook that watching the two of them was like seeing a mirror passed between generations, but the wrong ones. Still, no one said a word aloud, not to Jonathan, who remained cheerfully oblivious, and not to Margaret, whose gaze had grown harder in recent months. But whispers crept through the halls nonetheless, that Silas's birth had not just been unexpected, but unnatural in origin. As spring gave way to summer, the unspoken truth lingered over Whitaker Hill, like a low fog, heavy, undeniable, and yet never fully addressed. The staff no longer questioned the resemblance between Silas and Edmund. They accepted it with the same grim resignation as one accepts a bad harvest or a bitter winter. Margaret never admitted anything, but her behavior told a louder story. She flinched when Jonathan praised Silas in public. She snapped at the maids for leaving Edmund's boots too close to her bedroom door. Jonathan, for his part, remained blissfully unaware. He saw in Silas a final triumph, his name, his legacy secured. The truth, though, was more tragic. Silas was not Jonathan's son at all, but the child of a brother and sister bound by pride and desperation. Those closest to the family, those who had served them longest, began to keep their distance. Something about the boy's silence, his precision, his watchful eyes, felt no longer like a curiosity, but a warning. The kind of warning that grows sharper with time. At 17, Silas left Whitaker Hill for the first time on his own, heading to New York City, under the pretense of studying business. In truth, no one, not even Margaret, seemed to know what he planned to do there. He sent no letters. Weeks passed. Then came the telegram. Silas Whitaker had been shot and killed in a backroom saloon during a late-night card game gone wrong. The details were murky. One version claimed he'd been caught cheating and reached for a pistol, prompting another player to shoot first. But the weapon in Silas's coat was later found unloaded, raising the possibility that he hadn't intended to shoot at all, or perhaps intended to die. A darker version, whispered by a witness, too scared to testify publicly, suggested that Silas had confessed to violating another player's wife moments before the altercation, sharing disturbing details no outsider should have known. Whatever the truth, the result was the same. Silas died in the same cryptic fashion. He had lived half known, half hidden. His body was returned in a closed casket. The funeral was quiet, even among family. No mention was made of the saloon, the gun, or the woman. Only that the boy had passed too soon. After Silas's burial, the Whitaker household seemed to collapse inward, not with grief, but with silence. Margaret retreated from society altogether, rarely seen beyond the estate's winter garden. Edmund vanished back overseas within days of the funeral, leaving no forwarding address. Jonathan, by then a frail shadow of his former self, died less than a year later, still believing Silas was his rightful heir. The staff who had once whispered about the boy now spoke of him rarely and never with names. Records were quietly amended, photographs removed from mantles, and any trace of Silas's darker habits erased. It was as if he had never lived at all. But those who had worked the estate for years knew better. They remembered the scalpel, the eyes, the silence at supper. They remembered the way Margaret would pause before answering questions about her son, as if rehearsing the version of the story she was willing to let survive. Years later, an old housekeeper, half-blind and nearly forgotten, was asked about the Whitakers. She said only this: "Evil doesn't always howl, you know. Sometimes it's born in silk sheets and learns to smile before it speaks." Then she turned away, muttering a name no one had spoken aloud in decades. Not Jonathan, not Edmund. Only Silas. And the room went quiet. Today, the Whitaker estate stands abandoned, its windows dark, its halls quiet, but never quite still. Locals say the place feels colder than it should, even in summer. Some claim they've seen a boy in the upper window, black hair, pale face, staring without blinking. Most dismiss it as superstition, but in Whitaker Hill, people still draw their curtains before dusk, just in case. drawn to the mystery of Whitaker Hill. Tap subscribe to uncover more chilling stories that dive deep into the unusual, the hidden, and the unsettling. New narratives arrive each week, designed to linger in your mind long after they end. Be sure to like, share, and comment with your take. Some stories aren't meant to be forgotten.